Most gemstone regret doesn't happen when money changes hands. It happens later, when nothing is technically wrong, but something no longer feels right. Not after days, not even after months. Sometimes years later. These moments are rarely discussed, because at the expert level, regret doesn't look like failure. It looks like experience. It appears when a gemstone demands constant caution, when beauty peaks early and never deepens, when ownership becomes management. These are not beginner mistakes. They are decisions made by people who understood the stone and only later understood the cost of living with it. This list isn't about bad gemstones. Every stone here is real, respected, and admired. What they share is something quieter. Each one taught its lesson after ownership began. And the final stone on this list is almost never regretted at first, only after its story has been told one too many times. If you've ever owned a gemstone that felt perfect, until time changed the relationship, you'll recognize what comes next. Let's begin. Ranked 10th, Fire Opal, the gemstone that teaches regret early. Fire Opal has a way of capturing attention instantly. Its glowing orange and red tones, sometimes flashing hints of gold, feel alive under proper lighting. In a display case, Fire Opal doesn't just sit quietly, it commands the eye. Even experienced buyers, people who usually take their time, have been known to pause longer in front of it, and that pause is often where the story begins. Among seasoned gemstone professionals, Fire Opal is widely recognized as the stone that delivers regret earlier than most. Not because it is unattractive, not because it is misrepresented, but because it struggles to survive outside the controlled environment where it looks its best. Fire Opal is unusually sensitive to the world around it. Changes in humidity, temperature, and long-term exposure to dry air can slowly alter its appearance. Colors that once felt vivid begin to soften. Transparency can dull. In some cases, fine surface cracks appear, features that were completely absent at the time of purchase. What makes this uncomfortable is that nothing unethical usually happens in the transaction. The stone is genuine. Disclosures are accurate. Certificates, if present, are correct. The problem is not the sale. The problem is expectation. Fire Opal is often chosen for its immediate visual impact. It feels bold, expressive, different from more traditional gems. But over time, many experienced owners discover that a gemstone requiring constant vigilance rarely delivers long-term satisfaction. A stone that cannot adapt to daily life slowly shifts from being admired to being managed. This is where quiet regret takes hold. There are no dramatic complaints, no public warnings, just a subtle change in behavior. The stone is worn less often. It spends more time stored away. Eventually, it becomes a lesson rather than a favorite. Professionals who have lived with Fire Opal for years often describe the same realization. The stone is at its best before ownership begins. Once responsibility replaces excitement, the emotional balance changes. A gemstone should enhance a life, not require the owner to reorganize habits around it. And that realization tends to arrive sooner with Fire Opal than with almost any other gem. Has there ever been a gemstone that looked flawless in the showcase, but felt stressful once it became yours? If so, that experience is more common than most people admit. Fire Opal is not a bad gemstone. It still holds beauty, rarity, and cultural appeal. But it teaches one of the earliest and most important lessons in gemstone ownership. Visual impact does not equal long-term compatibility. Many experts quietly place Fire Opal on a personal, one-time experience list. Appreciated, remembered, but rarely repeated. Because in the long run, the most satisfying gemstones are not the ones that impress immediately, but the ones that age comfortably alongside their owners. Ranked 9th, Chrome Diopside, the stone that peaks too early. Chrome Diopside often enters a collection quietly and leaves it the same way. At first glance, it looks like a smart decision. The color can be striking, a deep, saturated green that instantly recalls far more famous gems. In controlled lighting, a fine chrome diopside can appear crisp, vivid, and surprisingly elegant. For experienced buyers, that resemblance is precisely the appeal. Chrome diopside has long been viewed as a practical alternative, visually impressive, accessible, and immediately gratifying. On the surface, it checks many boxes, but time is rarely kind to stones that borrow their identity from others. The regret associated with chrome diopside does not arrive dramatically. It arrives slowly, through wear. With regular use, the stone reveals its limitations. Its relative softness makes it vulnerable to scratches and abrasion. Edges lose their sharpness. Polish fades. Over time, the stone no longer looks new, and unlike harder gems, it does not age gracefully. Instead of developing character, it develops caution. Owners begin to hesitate before wearing it. Rings are rotated out of daily use. Pendants stay in their cases. What once felt versatile starts to feel fragile, not delicate in a charming way, but delicate in a restrictive one. This is where disappointment quietly sets in. Chrome diopside also struggles in the secondary market. While admired visually, it lacks the long-term demand that supports resale or trade. Even well-maintained stones often generate polite interest rather than genuine pursuit. The realization comes gradually. Beauty alone does not guarantee staying power. Among professionals, chrome diopside is often described as a stone that does not grow with its owner. It delivers its strongest impression early, then offers very little evolution beyond that moment. For collectors who value progression, stones that reveal new depth, presence, or confidence over time, this becomes unsatisfying. The regret is subtle, but consistent. There is no sense of having been misled. The stone performed exactly as its properties predicted. The disappointment lies in how quickly its role within a collection diminishes. What once felt like a clever choice begins to feel like a temporary solution. Have you ever owned a gemstone that looked exceptional at first, but somehow never became a favorite? What made it fade into the background over time? Chrome diopside often ends up remembered as a lesson in timing rather than taste. It shines brightest at the beginning of ownership, before daily reality exposes its limits. For many experts, that early peak is the core issue. A gemstone that reaches its full potential immediately has nowhere left to go. This is why chrome diopside frequently appears on quiet, would-not-repeat lists among seasoned buyers. Not because it lacks beauty, but because it lacks longevity in both wear and emotional attachment. In the long arc of gemstone ownership, the most valued stones are rarely the ones that impress quickly. They are the ones that remain interesting, resilient, and rewarding years later. Chrome diopside teaches this lesson gently, but unmistakably. And for those who have learned it once, learning it again holds very little appeal. Ranked 8th, Aquamarine, when size reveals too much. Aquamarine has long carried a reputation for clarity, calm color, and elegance. In well-cut stones, its cool blue tones feel effortless, clean, open, and refined. For experienced buyers, aquamarine often represents restraint and taste rather than excess. It is chosen not to shout, but to endure. That is precisely why disappointment can be so sharp when the cut goes wrong. A windowed aquamarine rarely looks problematic at first glance. In fact, many appear impressive in the showcase. Large table facets create the illusion of size. The stone looks bright, open, and generous. Under direct lighting, it can feel almost architectural. Broad planes of color, uninterrupted and smooth. The regret arrives later, under real-world conditions. Once worn outside controlled lighting, a windowed aquamarine begins to behave differently. Light no longer returns evenly through the stone. Instead of depth, the eye encounters emptiness. The center looks pale, washed out, or transparent in a way that feels unfinished. What once seemed clean now feels flat. This is not a flaw in the material. It is a consequence of proportion. Windowing exposes the true nature of aquamarine, a gemstone whose beauty depends heavily on how light is managed. When cut too shallow, the stone sacrifices internal life for surface presence. The result is a gem that photographs well but struggles to hold attention in motion. Professionals often describe this as a technical regret rather than an emotional one. The stone remains wearable. It does not degrade, but it never quite performs the way it was imagined to. Over time, owners become increasingly aware that the stone's size is doing more harm than good. Larger windowed aquamarines also create a specific kind of expert frustration. They look impressive to those unfamiliar with gemstones, but quietly disappoint those who know what to look for. The owner becomes aware of the gap between appearance and substance, and that awareness is difficult to ignore. Have you ever owned a gemstone that looked impressive in photos or under lights, but felt strangely lifeless when worn? What tipped you off? This type of regret tends to surface only after extended ownership. At first, the stone feels good enough, then comparisons begin. A smaller aquamarine with better proportions suddenly feels richer, deeper, more confident. The windowed stone, by contrast, starts to feel exposed, almost unfinished. Among seasoned collectors, windowed aquamarines are often cited as stones that taught an important lesson. Size does not compensate for depth. In gemstones, restraining cutting often produces greater presence than scale ever could. The regret here is not dramatic. It is quiet and technical, but persistent. The stone is not replaced immediately. It simply stops being reached for. Eventually, it becomes a reminder that aquamarine rewards balance, not ambition. For experts, this is a lesson learned once and rarely forgotten. A gemstone should reveal its beauty gradually, not all at once. When a cut gives everything away on the surface, there is very little left to discover over time. And in the long relationship between owner and stone, discovery is what keeps interest alive. Ranked 7th, Paraíba-style Tourmaline. When color comes with anxiety. Paraíba Tourmaline changed how the gemstone world thought about color. That electric blue-green glow, almost neon under the right light, reset expectations overnight. It felt modern, rare, and unmistakably alive. Even seasoned professionals were not immune to its pull. That influence gave rise to an entire category, Paraíba-style tourmalines. At first glance, low-grade Paraíba-style stones appear to deliver the essence of the experience. The color is there. The vibrancy is convincing. In a showcase, especially under bright lighting, the difference between elite material and commercial grade can feel surprisingly small. For many experienced buyers, this creates a dangerous sense of confidence. The regret does not come from being deceived. It comes from living with the stone. Lower-grade Paraíba-style tourmalines often combine three difficult traits: intense color, visible inclusions, and relatively soft durability. On paper, each issue seems manageable. In reality, they compound. Over time, the stone becomes something the owner thinks about too often. Scratches appear more easily than expected. Facet edges soften. Inclusions that once felt acceptable start catching the eye. What initially felt vibrant begins to feel fragile. The owner becomes cautious, then protective, then hesitant. That hesitation is the turning point. A gemstone meant to be enjoyed should invite use, not demand restraint. Yet many owners of lower-grade Paraíba-style tourmalines quietly admit the same thing. The stress of wearing the stone slowly outweighs the pleasure of its color. Rings are worn less frequently. Pendants are chosen only for special occasions. The stone remains admired, but increasingly from a distance. This type of regret is especially uncomfortable for experts because it is rooted in knowledge. They understand why the stone behaves this way. There is no mystery, no surprise. And yet, knowing the explanation does not remove the tension of ownership. Another layer of disappointment appears when long-term value is considered. While top-tier Paraíba tourmalines maintain strong demand, lower-grade material does not enjoy the same confidence in the secondary market. Color alone is not enough. Buyers become selective. Liquidity narrows. What once felt like a vibrant choice begins to feel oddly specific and harder to move on from. Have you ever owned a gemstone that looked incredible, but made you nervous every time you wore it? At what point did that anxiety change how you felt about the stone? Among professionals, Paraíba-style tourmalines often become a lesson in emotional cost. The stone delivers excitement early, but demands constant attention later. Over time, that imbalance erodes satisfaction. The owner stops thinking about how beautiful the stone is and starts thinking about how careful they need to be. This is why low-grade Paraíba-style tourmaline frequently appears on quiet regret lists. Not because the color fails, but because the ownership experience becomes heavy. Experienced buyers tend to remember this lesson clearly. Brilliance should feel liberating, not restrictive. A gemstone that replaces joy with vigilance rarely earns a permanent place in a collection. And once that realization sets in, repeating the experience holds very little appeal. Ranked 6th, heavily treated Tanzanite. When enhancement becomes a limitation. Tanzanite entered the gemstone world with remarkable speed. Its violet blue color, soft yet vivid, felt instantly distinctive. For many experienced buyers, it represented a rare moment when a gemstone looked both contemporary and elegant at the same time. Early exposure created strong emotional associations, and those associations lingered. Treatment was always part of the story. Heat treatment is widely accepted in Tanzanite and openly disclosed. On its own, that is not the issue. The regret begins when treatment moves beyond enhancement and starts defining the stone's entire identity. Heavily treated Tanzanite often looks spectacular at first. Color zoning disappears. Saturation becomes even. Under showroom lighting, the stone appears refined and complete, but over time, a different reality emerges, one that has little to do with appearance and everything to do with position in the market. Among professionals, Tanzanite occupies a delicate space. It is well known, widely loved, and yet carefully evaluated. When treatment is heavy, buyers begin knowing exactly what they are getting, and just as importantly, what they are not. The stone becomes visually attractive but conceptually constrained. This is where regret quietly forms. Heavily treated Tanzanite tends to age without narrative growth. It does not gain new appreciation over time. It does not invite deeper curiosity. In the secondary market, interest becomes polite rather than enthusiastic. Buyers ask fewer questions. Conversations end sooner. The stone performs its role once and then remains fixed in that role indefinitely. For experienced owners, this stagnation is frustrating. A gemstone should evolve in perception as knowledge increases. Instead, heavily treated Tanzanite feels static. It remains pleasant, but rarely compelling. Over time, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a conclusion that arrived too early. Another source of regret lies in comparison. As owners encounter finer, less aggressively treated material, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Subtle color shifts, natural depth, and internal complexity begin to matter more than uniform saturation. The heavily treated stone, once admired, begins to feel simplified. Have you ever owned a gemstone that looked perfect at first, but became less interesting the more you learned about it? What changed your perception? This is not a story about deception. Disclosures are clear. Certificates are accurate. The disappointment comes from understanding the trade-off too late. Enhancement delivers immediate satisfaction, but can quietly limit long-term engagement. Among professionals, heavily treated Tanzanite often becomes a one-time experience. Appreciated for what it is, but rarely pursued again. It teaches a subtle lesson. Refinement achieved too quickly leaves little room for discovery. In the long arc of gemstone ownership, stones that invite continued curiosity tend to hold their place longer. Those that resolve themselves completely at the beginning often fade into the background. Heavily treated Tanzanite remains beautiful. But for many experts, beauty alone is not enough to sustain interest over time. Ranked 5th, emerald. When rarity demands too much in return. Emerald has always occupied a special position in the gemstone world. Its color carries authority. Its history commands respect. For experienced buyers, emerald is not chosen lightly. It represents taste, legacy, and confidence earned over time. And yet among professionals, heavily included emeralds are one of the most quietly regretted purchases. At the moment of acquisition, inclusions are rarely seen as a deal breaker. In fact, they are often reframed as character. Emerald's natural formation almost guarantees internal features, and buyers are taught early that a clean emerald is an exception, not the rule. Under magnification, inclusions are accepted. Under showroom lighting, they often disappear entirely. The issue does not appear immediately. It emerges through ownership. Heavily included emeralds demand constant accommodation. They are sensitive to impact, vulnerable to pressure. Even routine wear introduces risk. Over time, owners begin to handle them differently, more carefully, more consciously, and eventually more reluctantly. The stone stops being an extension of personal style and becomes an object of ongoing concern. This shift is subtle, but decisive. Professionals often describe a moment when admiration turns into responsibility. Instead of enjoying the emerald, the owner starts protecting it. Rings are removed for ordinary activities. Bracelets are avoided altogether. What was once a symbol of confidence begins to require vigilance. Another layer of regret comes from maintenance. Heavily included emeralds often rely on clarity enhancements to maintain their appearance. With time, routine care becomes unavoidable. Treatments must be monitored. Cleaning options are limited. The stone's condition becomes something to manage rather than something to trust. For experienced buyers, this creates tension. A gemstone of this stature is expected to integrate into life, not resist it. There is also a psychological dimension that develops slowly. As knowledge deepens, comparisons become unavoidable. Emeralds with fewer inclusions, better structural integrity, or more restrained cutting begin to feel fundamentally different, not necessarily more beautiful, but more stable. The heavily included stone, once justified by tradition, begins to feel compromised. Have you ever owned a gemstone that felt prestigious at first, but gradually became something you worried about more than you enjoyed? At what point did that feeling change? Importantly, this regret is not driven by aesthetics. Many heavily included emeralds remain visually captivating for decades. The disappointment stems from the cost of ownership, emotional, practical, and psychological. A gemstone that requires constant accommodation eventually alters how it is valued. Among experts, heavily included emeralds often become stones that are respected rather than loved. They are acknowledged, preserved, and sometimes retired. Rarely are they replaced with the same enthusiasm that once led to their purchase. This is why such emeralds appear repeatedly on quiet regret lists. Not because they fail as gemstones, but because they ask more from the owner than they give back over time. Emerald remains one of the great stones, but experienced buyers learn a critical distinction early. Rarity alone does not guarantee satisfaction. Stability, confidence, and ease of ownership matter just as much as history and color. And once that lesson is learned, it tends to shape every emerald decision that follows. Ranked fourth, origin-dependent Spinel. When the story carries more weight than the stone. Spinel has earned genuine respect among gemstone professionals. It is durable, naturally colored, and capable of exceptional brilliance. In many ways, it represents what experienced buyers look for once novelty fades: honesty, resilience, and understated beauty. And yet, Spinel tied too tightly to origin is a recurring source of quiet regret. At the center of the issue is not the gemstone itself, but the narrative built around it. Certain Spinels command attention almost entirely because of where they come from. A specific valley, a historic mine, a short-lived discovery. In the right circles, these details matter deeply. Within that context, the stone feels important, even inevitable. The problem appears when the stone leaves that context. Outside a narrow group of specialists, origin-heavy Spinel often loses its clarity of value. The color may be attractive, the cut may be excellent, but without shared recognition of the source, the justification for its premium becomes fragile. Conversations shift from enthusiasm to explanation. An explanation is rarely a position of strength. This is where regret begins to form. Experienced buyers tend to assume that quality will translate universally. With origin-dependent Spinel, that assumption is tested. The stone performs beautifully on a technical level, but struggles socially in the market. It becomes impressive only after context is supplied, and context does not always travel well. Over time, this creates friction. Owners become aware that the stone's appeal is conditional. It shines brightest among those who already understand its story. Beyond that circle, it often blends into the background, competing visually with stones that require no introduction at all. Another layer of disappointment emerges during resale or trade. While not a liquid, origin-dependent Spinel frequently encounters hesitation. Buyers ask careful questions. Interest narrows. Momentum slows. The stone does not fail, but it rarely surprises on the upside. For professionals, this realization is particularly uncomfortable. The purchase was informed. The research was thorough. The stone is exactly what it claims to be, and yet its value feels confined rather than expansive. Have you ever owned a gemstone that felt special only when you explained its story? At what point did that realization change how you felt about owning it? Among seasoned collectors, origin-heavy spinel often becomes a lesson in portability. A gemstone story should enhance its appeal, not be required to sustain it. When origin becomes the primary justification, the stone's independence quietly erodes. This does not diminish spinel as a gem. In fact, many experts continue to favor spinel precisely because of its intrinsic qualities. The regret arises only when origin overshadows substance, when the stone's identity becomes inseparable from a narrative that not everyone shares. Over time, experienced buyers tend to recalibrate. They begin prioritizing spinels that stand confidently on color, cut, and presence alone. Stones that speak clearly without footnotes. Origin-dependent spinel teaches a subtle but lasting lesson. The strongest gemstones carry their value with them. When a stone needs its origin to be understood before it can be appreciated, ownership becomes narrower than expected. And once that constraint is felt, it is rarely forgotten. Ranked third, Grandidierite, when rarity loses its timing advantage. Grandidierite entered the public eye quietly, then all at once. For years, it existed mostly as a museum mineral, known by specialists, admired from a distance, rarely owned. When faceable material began appearing more consistently, the reaction among experienced buyers was immediate and intense. The color felt unfamiliar yet refined, a blue-green tone that sat somewhere between restraint and intrigue. For professionals, this combination triggered a familiar instinct. Act early. Early acquisitions of Grandidierite carried a powerful sense of foresight. The stone felt undiscovered, academically legitimate, and genuinely rare. Ownership came with the satisfaction of having recognized something before it was widely understood. In that moment, the decision felt not just correct, but timely. The regret did not come from the stone itself. It came from what happened next. As availability stabilized, Grandidierite quietly shifted categories. It did not become common, but it became known. More stones entered the market. More images circulated. More conversations took place. The narrative changed from almost impossible to own to occasionally available with the right connections. This transition altered the emotional equation. For early buyers, the stone did not lose beauty or legitimacy, but it lost momentum. What once felt like a defining acquisition slowly became a static one. The sense of being ahead of the curve faded, replaced by the realization that the curve had flattened. Among experts, this creates a particular kind of regret, one rooted in timing rather than judgment. Grandidierite did exactly what markets often do. It normalized. Prices adjusted, expectations recalibrated. The stone settled into a niche that was respectable, but less electric. Owners who entered during the peak of excitement found themselves holding something that felt finished before its story had fully matured. Another layer of disappointment emerged during long-term ownership. Grandidierite is admired for its color, but it does not dramatically evolve with wear or familiarity. Its appeal is subtle and consistent, qualities that reward patience, but do not amplify emotional return over time. For those who purchased it during a surge of anticipation, that steadiness can feel anticlimactic. Have you ever bought a gemstone because it felt like a rare moment, only to realize later that the moment had already passed? What changed your perspective? Professionals rarely describe Grandidierite as a mistake. Instead, it is remembered as a lesson in sequencing. Buying early is only rewarding when early ownership is followed by sustained relevance. When recognition arrives too quickly, early adopters lose the advantage they assumed they had secured. This does not diminish Grandidierite's place in the gemstone world. It remains legitimate, distinctive, and quietly elegant. But for many experts, it became a reminder that rarity alone is not enough. Timing determines how that rarity is experienced. Over time, Grandidierite often shifts from a centerpiece to a reference point. It is respected, discussed, and occasionally revisited, but rarely pursued again with the same urgency. The excitement that once surrounded it becomes historical rather than personal. For seasoned buyers, this is a valuable realization. The most satisfying acquisitions are not just rare at the moment of purchase. They continue to feel rare long after the initial excitement fades. Grandidierite teaches that lesson clearly, and once learned, it tends to influence every early opportunity that follows. Ranked second, Jeremejevite, when ownership becomes purely theoretical. Jeremejevite occupies a very specific place in the gemstone world. It is genuinely rare, academically respected, and immediately recognizable to those with deep knowledge. Its appeal is quiet and intellectual rather than visual. For experienced buyers, that combination can be irresistible. At the moment of acquisition, Jeremejevite feels like a milestone. Owning one signals entry into a narrower circle, collectors who value scarcity, mineralogical significance, and difficulty of acquisition over display. The stone is not chosen to impress others. It is chosen to know it is there. And that knowledge carries weight. The regret does not come quickly. It develops through absence. Jeremejevite is rarely worn, not because it is unattractive, but because it is impractical. The stone's brittleness, sharp facet junctions, and sensitivity to impact make daily use unrealistic. Even careful settings feel like compromises. Over time, the owner stops considering how to wear it and starts assuming it should not be worn at all. This is where the relationship quietly changes. A gemstone that lives entirely in storage begins to feel abstract. It is owned but not experienced, admired but not interacted with. For many experts, this creates a subtle dissatisfaction that grows over time. The stone exists more as a concept than a presence. There is also a psychological tension unique to Jeremejevite. Its rarity makes replacement unlikely. Its fragility makes risk unacceptable. Together, these qualities freeze the stone in place. It becomes something to protect rather than enjoy. Over time, the act of ownership feels increasingly passive. Professionals often describe a moment of clarity, the realization that the stone contributes very little to daily life. It is important but distant, valuable but silent. The satisfaction of acquisition is not reinforced by use, memory, or association. Have you ever owned a gemstone that felt significant, but somehow never became part of your life? When did you realize it was more stored than lived with? Another layer of regret emerges when perspective widens. As collections mature, many experts find themselves gravitating towards stones that balance rarity with presence. Gems that can be worn, handled, and revisited without anxiety begin to feel more rewarding. Jeremejevite, by contrast, remains fixed, unchanging, untouched, and increasingly remote. This does not diminish its legitimacy. Jeremejevite remains a remarkable gemstone by any technical standard, but its role is limited. It excels as an example, a reference, a proof of access. It struggles as a companion. Among seasoned buyers, Jeremejevite often becomes the stone that clarified an important distinction. Ownership alone is not fulfillment. A gemstone's value is not measured only by how rare it is, but by how often it meaningfully enters one's life. For that reason, Jeremejevite frequently appears near the top of quiet regret lists, not because it failed, but because it never truly participated. It remained perfect, untouched, and distant. And for many experts, that distance ultimately outweighs the satisfaction of having acquired it. In first place, Libyan desert glass, when the story outlives the stone. Libyan desert glass occupies a place no traditional gemstone ever could. It is not admired first for brilliance, cut, or durability. It is admired for its origin. Formed by an ancient cosmic event in the Sahara, this pale yellow glass carries a narrative that reaches beyond Earth itself. For experienced collectors, that narrative is powerful, almost irresistible. At the moment of acquisition, Libyan desert glass feels profound. It represents deep time, catastrophe, transformation. The idea that something violent and incomprehensible created an object that can now be held in the hand. For professionals who have seen every conventional gemstone, Libyan desert glass offers something different, meaning without comparison. And that is exactly where the regret eventually begins. Unlike gemstones that reward familiarity, Libyan desert glass peaks emotionally at the moment its story is told. The first explanation carries weight, the second reinforces it, but over time, repetition dulls impact. The object remains unchanged, while the narrative slowly loses urgency. What once felt extraordinary becomes familiar. The stone itself does not evolve. Libyan desert glass has no internal complexity to rediscover. No interaction with light that deepens with wear. No gradual relationship formed through use. It is not meant to be worn often and rarely is. Instead, it exists as a relic, displayed, referenced, and occasionally revisited, but seldom integrated into daily life. For many experts, this creates a subtle but persistent disconnect. The satisfaction of ownership becomes entirely dependent on the story. And when a gemstone relies exclusively on narrative, it becomes vulnerable to time. As knowledge expands, as curiosity moves on, the stone is left behind, unchanged, static, and increasingly silent. There is also a deeper psychological realization that emerges slowly. Libyan desert glass is often acquired during a period of fascination with impact events, ancient history, or symbolic meaning. But fascination is not permanent. When interests shift, the object does not shift with them. It remains fixed to a chapter that has already closed. Have you ever owned something whose story once felt powerful, but over time stopped resonating the way it used to? When did you notice that shift? Among seasoned collectors, Libyan desert glass is rarely described as a mistake. It is described as an experience, one that feels complete very quickly. The stone delivers its full value almost immediately, and then offers very little beyond that initial exchange. This is why it quietly rises to the top of regret lists. Not because it disappoints in quality or authenticity, but because it teaches a difficult lesson. Stories are finite. Objects that depend entirely on them often are too. Experienced buyers eventually learn that the most enduring stones are not those with the grandest origins, but those that continue to reward attention long after the story has been told. Stones that reveal new qualities through time, wear, and personal association. Libyan desert glass does not do that. It remains exactly what it was on the first day of ownership: profound, ancient, complete. And for many experts, that completeness is precisely the problem. Once the story has been absorbed, there is nothing left to discover. The stone becomes a reminder, not of cosmic wonder, but of a moment when meaning was mistaken for longevity. That realization tends to arrive quietly, but when it does, it places Libyan desert glass firmly at the top of the list. Regret at this level doesn't mean a mistake was made. It means something was learned. Every gemstone on this list is real, respected, and still admired. What changed was not the stone, but the relationship with it. Over time, experienced buyers stop chasing rarity, color, or stories alone. They start paying attention to something quieter: how a gemstone fits into life after the excitement fades. The stones that last are rarely the ones that impress immediately. They are the ones that remain comfortable to own, easy to return to, able to grow alongside the person who wears them. That understanding doesn't come from books or showcases. It comes from living with a stone long enough to hear what it stops saying. If you've ever owned a gemstone that taught you more after you bought it than before, what was the lesson? Sometimes the most valuable part of a gemstone is not what it is, but what it quietly teaches over time.